Wonderful. And it's a great pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk today about using computer vision to advance the sciences. And this is joint work with a large number of people, some of whom are in my lab and some of whom have graduated and gone on to do lots of different things that are all over the world now, although primarily concentrated in the Bay Area. And so normally, the way that most of my sort of talks historically start as really a 3D computer vision person. I sort of start a talk, I show you pictures of 3D reconstructions, and here's something from some past work of ours that reconstructs hidden parts of scenes, for example. And I was primarily focused on the sort of classic bread and butter computer vision problems. But then recently, I've become really interested in talking about stuff which is sort of not this. And so in some sense, I'm going to be not talking about sort of standard computer vision today, but I'm going to be instead talking about something a little bit different. And in some sense, sort of thinking about how things are why I was doing this is I think it's interesting to see how computer vision can really have an impact, not just in sort of what the sort of standard problems that we've primarily focused on, but also really, really beyond. And so I wanted to show you some of the work from my lab where we're trying to use this to advance the sciences and make data that people really care about. And so throughout the talk, actually, a number of the things that Voxel 51 is excited about are things that we're excited about as well. There are a couple of sort of core themes that sort of resonate quite nicely, including the real importance of data and managing data and looking at data, and how that ultimately is really the big thing that drives progress in these fields. So today I'm going to talk about totally different stuff. So I'll begin by showing you just to motivate you. Here's a picture of the sun. You probably have not seen a picture like this. This is extreme ultraviolet light, and this is sort of from the part of the sun, which is basically only about 50,000 degrees Kelvin. So it's actually quite hot by our standards, but it's a relatively cool part of the sun. And if you zoom in on this, there is this wonderful, fascinating 3D structure that's sort of on the sun. And I sort of got interested in the sciences because I chatted with the person who showed me this type of data and said he wanted to use this in order to solve lots of different tasks. And there's all sorts of fascinating stuff. And you can watch the sun data for hours and hours and hours on end. And sort of this, you have this 3D structure of the sun, and underneath it all, there's actually a magnetic field on the surface that's actually throughout the entire sun, but we can measure it at the surface. And so here, the sort of purple stuff, this is a sunspot. The purple stuff is going out of the sun, the magnetic field going out, and the orange is going in. And actually, if you still have eclipse glasses, maybe some of you were lucky to see the one in Europe recently. If you take them outside and you look at the sun using the eclipse glasses, don't do this with binoculars or looking directly at the sun. In many times, you can actually see sunspots yourself directly with your eyes. You just have to go outside and get really lucky that there happens to be a large sunspot that you can see just by taking your eclipse glasses, putting them on, and looking out. And these sunspots are sort of colder parts of the sun which are magnetically active. And what happens is there's a magnetic field that sort of drives lots of things like these. You can see these loops. You might think they look 3D. They are in fact 3D. And just to give you a sense, each of the sort of pixels here is about the size of, I believe, about the state of Connecticut. So it's quite large. And so it's sort of, you have all this incredible data. And so I got really excited about how do we use this data in order to empower people in other disciplines. And one of the things was that in computer vision, we have all these amazing tools, and there are lots and lots of people who are hungry for these tools in lots of different areas that we just didn't expect. And so maybe some of the things that you're working on are things where it's totally, surprising. And one of the things I find really exciting about talking to people at meetups and sort of hackathons is there are all sorts of really interesting ideas that I would never have thought of where you can use computer vision to solve really impactful problems. And sort of, we're now at a point in time when doing computer vision is actually a lot of fun. And so I was doing computer vision a long time ago. And back then people really didn't want to talk to us. It was kind of, we had solutions that really didn't work very well. But nowadays we have things that are actually have a large potential for impact. Okay. So there's actually a whole vector magnetic field. There are 3 components. If you've dealt with surface normals, it's very much like that. So there's a 3D structure that you can recover. So anyway, so I got interested in producing magnetic field maps of the sun. And I guess one of the questions that if you've never seen any of this, you might have is like, why on earth would you care about this? And for a lot of scientific disciplines, there's essentially like these cornerstone data products that are used throughout the field and essentially are like a limiting factor in how people do research. And so what happens is people do large scale simulations, people do forecasts of solar activity. So for example, you may have seen aurora about 2 years ago in May, and that was due to extreme solar activity. And then one of the things I didn't know is that people actually pay for space weather forecasts. And so satellite operators routinely adjust what their satellites are doing in response to how the sun's sort of magnetic field is evolving. Same thing with power grid operators, and people adjust the power in advance of space weather activity, which is driven underneath all this is driven by a magnetic field. So here, if this is like a version of the field which has been unwrapped, like a sort of 3D asset, you have like you take like a sphere and you sort of unwrap it onto a flat surface. So this is very much like a map you might find hanging on a wall. And the blue stuff is sort of concentrated areas of magnetic field. So anyway, so what I got interested is like, I started looking at this, and I think maybe the exciting thing, big picture lesson, is that you can look at what other people are doing and spot analogies in terms of what we can do in computer vision. So one thing I found was that people observe this magnetic field with lots of different instruments. So one instrument, for example, captures this big picture of the sun. And this is horribly subsampled. It's gone through video compression as well on your end, but these are actually 4096 by 4096 images. So this instrument has captured 4K movies of the sun for now decades. And this is high resolution, but it's actually not as high as other things. And so there are other instruments that, for example, capture a much more dense scan. And these instruments take, for example, like an hour in order to capture a scan. And they capture them at very, very high resolution and produce really, really detailed data. And these also produce sort of the estimates of things like the magnetic field. And what happens is people in these fields typically take this data and they apply sort of first principles models to try to convert them into physical properties to monitor things. And there's this big opportunity here. And so what I realized is you can actually learn to take lower quality data and produce higher quality data. And this is very much like if you think about how 3D computer vision has changed. It's really amazing. I started doing 3D computer vision when stuff really didn't work. And nowadays, actually, you can actually really take ordinary images and produce estimates of depth maps. And this actually works surprisingly well. It's not perfect, but it works surprisingly well. And this basic idea and this recipe translates quite well into sciences, where you can take a lower quality instrument that, for example, captures high frame rate data. So this is basically as fast as you need it, and produces enormous fields of view, which covers everything. And you can sort of upsample to really, really high quality data, which is from a higher quality instrument that captures a small field of view. And so you can sort of fill these observational gaps and build virtual instruments, which is kind of fun. And one of the things that's interesting is that the approach that we're taking is we're not trying to tackle these big picture age-old problems like end-to-end. Like we're not trying to necessarily directly improve flare forecasting or predicting are there going to be coronal mass ejections and all sorts of other stuff that people directly care about. We're really tackling the problems where there's tons of data. So all these problems we have, billions and billions and billions of pixels of supervision. And so machine learning is really poised well to work here. And the thing that I'm not going to really talk about here, which is a huge challenge, is basically building these systems that go from kind of sort of working to like really working. And so the people I work with are really interested in extremely high quality data, where they want to be able to know basically every single pixel that is produced. They want it to be accurate. And if it's not accurate, they really need to have that flagged. And so the systems we build, we're operating in a very different regime than a lot of traditional computer vision, which often, you get to like 80% accuracy or whatever, or 80% MAP in a computer vision problem. And often what happens is people kind of move on to something new. But the difficulty is moving from that works really well to works really, really well is very difficult. And for that, it's the main challenge is really becoming very, very familiar with your data and all of the difficulties. And so this was done by a number of PhD students, Royu, who's currently a PhD student, and Richard, who's now in the Bay Area nearby at SoftMax. So I'm just going to show you some of the outputs of the system. So here's another video of the sun. This is from May 2024. The left is what the sun is looking like in sort of the 3D structure above, and the right is the magnetic field map we're able to produce. And so you can see this is a super, super active thing. And let me just show you some of the results of what this enables. So let's zoom in on an active region on the sun. And using sort of traditional pipelines, if I flip back and forth, what happens is the traditional pipelines are actually not very smooth, typically. And we built systems. On the left is our one, on the right is the traditional pipeline. The left one is much, much smoother, and it should come through over Zoom. But basically, if it's not fully, if there are bandwidth issues, what happens in the right, there are a lot of cases where the solution sort of flips back and forth between two radically different colors. And this is totally sort of not real. And so one of the things we've discovered is that the AI systems are actually really incredibly much more, much smoother, which is actually a really cool finding. And so we're currently taking this model, and we're actually currently under review, hopefully hearing very soon. This should be integrated into the pipeline at a NASA mission, which would be really, really cool. All right. So this is a little bit about how I got started. So I got really interested in this in large part because of the data. And I think one of the fun things about computer vision is you really get to look at lots and lots of fun data. In all the areas I've worked in, the data itself is really exciting, and you love, a lot of computer vision people, we love collecting data, we love looking through our data. It's really all about the data. But once I started working on science applications, I got this really interesting email. So this guy at the University of Michigan, where I previously worked, emailed and said, yeah, hey, I got this. He says that basically bird evolution seems a bit outside your typical research topics. And I said, well, yeah, I mean, bird evolution really probably is. And he basically emailed me. He said, I want to basically measure all these bird specimens in 3D. I said, oh, this is really cool. So I invited Brian to come over to my office, and he showed up, and he convinced me. He said, we have all this data for you. And as soon as I hear data, I'm almost always interested. And let me just show you what this data looks like. So here's the data actually just taken from above. Each of these squares is like 1 inch. And so this is a very, very small. So this is actually a ruby crowned tanager from South America. And this is it's basically a box. It's a specimen taken from a long time ago. And so it's this immensely fragile specimen. And actually, if you zoom in, this was actually collected in Paraguay, in a relatively rural part of Paraguay, so a very remote area. And it was actually also captured in 1979. So this is a specimen that is basically irreplaceable. And so museums, it turns out, have very large collections of specimens. And so actually, if you go to any museum, you see all the specimens on display, and you think, oh, this is very cool. But what you don't know is that there are all these lockers of more specimens. And it's very much like, and I know I'm dating myself here, it's very much like one of those Indiana Jones movies where they sort of take the ark containing the crate containing the artifact, and they sort of push it back into this massive warehouse, and there are stacks and stacks of boxes of stuff. And if you go to any sort of museum, like the Field Museum of Natural History, the American Museum of Natural History in New York, there are just hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of specimens just sitting there. And these are completely impossible to replace because they've been captured and collected over sort of centuries, and this is generational work by people. And so it's just not possible to sort of replace these. So anyway, what happens is you get these specimens, and the way people convert them into data is you basically have people measure things. And so this is essentially everyone's doing this by hand. Occasionally you do it by CT scan, which is even slower. But what happens is you take the specimen, and then often a biology graduate student has to go and find the tibia. You're doing a study about tibia, you try to find the tibia. And then depending on which audience this is, like either people can immediately spot the tibia, or if you're like a computer vision person like myself, you actually don't know which the tibia is and you have to search for it. And so you actually have these specimens, and actually measuring this is extremely difficult and labor intensive. It's very easy to get 10 samples. It's pretty easy to get 100 samples. 1,000 is a massive effort, and like the type of data we like in computer vision, hundreds of thousands to millions, this is just not happening. Okay, so what happened is we started trying to get skeletal trait data, and people care about this data in order to do statistical studies about how birds evolve. And so what happened is we had the collection of past efforts, and the size of the circle here indicates how many traits are measured. So for example, one trait might be, for example, the length between my wrist and my elbow, or the equivalent of that on a bird. And the y-axis is the number of specimens that were measured. So you're typically talking about a couple hundred, maybe a few thousand if you're very lucky, and typically with small numbers of traits measured. And so what we did is basically realize that this line of work is massively data starved. It very much reminds me a lot of computer vision back in the day, where we had this sort of, we have Caltech 101, we have, we have a couple of dozen images of some concept, and how on earth are we going to learn, how to distinguish these two different types of flowers that look very similar, have similar coloring from just 2 dozen samples each. And then essentially, it's impossible actually really to get this to scale up. So if specimen measurement takes about 15 minutes for a well-trained, well-caffeinated, really eager person. And so you can maybe get 8,000 per year, which is just not the numbers that we expect in computer vision. And the handling requires training, so you can't turn it over to other people. And it's like this vicious cycle where it takes 15 minutes, so you have to measure a few, so you have to pick them carefully. So you have to spend time searching throughout the collection in order to get the ones that you care about. And so it's this really horrible, basically the data is the limiting bottleneck. And so what we did is we produced a new data set where we have like 12,000 specimens, and we have a very large number of traits. And so this is a massive new data set. And this is the largest data set, at least at the time of submission. And we had like 1,800 species and 10 traits, and it took about a person month to do. So this is like way faster. So this was totally not possible using the old methods. And what was interesting was that we built this by building like a interesting combination of both thinking about how do you get the data in the hardware, as well as how do you process it in terms of software. So we ended up having like a really nice machine vision camera. Some of you probably work with these all the time, but I had just never really experienced what buying a really high quality machine vision camera will do in terms of the clarity and having it focused at exactly the right place is just incredible. We had like a backup RGBD sensor. We had some backup calibration tags. We were very worried about collecting all the data and having it go wrong. And then we also had this very weird system where you can see like a little ruler where you can pull down. It's basically a flat surface that what happens is Brian originally wanted to do 3D measurements, but I realized that this was very hard. And we just should start off with 2D. And we just sort of converted to measurements on a plane. And the dumping system we built, or really Brian built in his garage, enables that the bones can be returned to their cases and we don't miss anything. And we don't have to place anything so that you can just put the bones right on the surface. And one thing to keep in mind is the curators of these museums are very cautious. So remember that some of these have been collected over decades. And so they don't let you do random stuff with it. You can't do certain things. So two students, they were actually both undergrads at the time. Now they're off doing other stuff. Gemetri is a PhD student at Cornell, and Z is started a PhD at Stanford and now is a serial startup founder and doing all sorts of really fun stuff in the Bay Area. They built a system that can just detect stuff. And it was basically using mask RCNN. This was relatively, we just needed something which worked. And if we measure in 2D, but with a fixed camera, you can actually get 3D measurements. And the training data ended up being a big challenge. And so figuring out how to split this off was a bit tricky because you needed one person to be able to identify consistently and correctly like what tibia are, what to do in edge cases if something is connected, how to separate things off. And then everybody also did work with an AI assisted tool to do the segmentation. And so there's a lot of data annotation. And by doing the annotation, we can then produce a much better detection system. So we had some results. So we can get a large number of traits. We expanded later to having 11 traits. And we're able to get here, for example, skulls from the collection. And we got human or better accuracy, sort of like about 1 millimeter of error. And it was very, very repeatable. And one of the things they care about is there biases one way or another. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, like, why on earth do people measure all these things? So let me give you a flavor of what you can do with this set of data. So one of the things you can do is you can look at, for example, how big are the bones relative to the wing size? You can sort of have a measurement of, for example, the shape of wing bones. And you can try to explain the shape as a function of properties. So for example, like the temperature. And then one of the things that we found, for example, using this data was that even after you control for lots and lots and lots of things, the temperature is highly predictive of shape, which suggests that thermoregulation predicts shape's evolution. And so a lot of problems in the sciences are driven by you need to get a large number of data points and fit a statistical model. And then essentially where computer vision can have a huge impact is by providing highly reliable data that can then be used to fit models. Let me just show you some of the other stuff. We also found that some bones are really easy to find, other ones are really hard. Skulls are very easy. You can train a model to detect these. There's like these little tiny digits in the claw. These are very hard to find. They basically, I have a very hard time finding these when I do this. And we can sort of like, we can't necessarily sort of fill in the details very easily. And so what happens, we can estimate the missing things using sort of statistical models as well. So here I'm just showing you this to give a sense. And so this is like, for example, we have spatial distribution. Most of our birds are from South America. But the last thing I'll show you is actually results that just came out in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. And one of the things you can do is if you have this data, you can fit a model that explains the data you see. But basically, it builds a model of how evolution played out in order to explain the data that you see. And what happens is, based off of a couple assumptions, you can try to figure out when evolution sped up or slowed down in the data collection you have. And so what happens is the lead author of this, who's now starting at University of North Carolina, Charlotte, he found that basically, if you go back in time, there are sort of certain periods where the rate of change of evolution, the sort of rate of change of evolution dramatically changed. There's a slowdown, there's a speed up, or there's a slowdown here. And so the blue thing is a decrease in the rate. The red thing is an increase in the rate. And then he figured this out, and then he actually sort of plotted against other things that we know about the past. So for example, basically you have rough proxies for the temperature. And what happened is that the peaks actually line up very carefully with changes in environment. So the red peak on the left, this lines up, there's a gigantic increase in the rate of evolution right after an extinction. And so this is the Eocene Oligocene transition, which was basically a massive extinction and reshaping of the landscape of the environments. And so this was a place where basically there's a ton of acceleration of evolution. And then there was another period where there's sort of a warming, which sort of stopped a sort of slowdown in evolution that you see at this sort of blue peak. Basically, the peak is going up, and then sort of there's a transition which happens around that period. Now, of course, this is trying to infer stuff in the past, and these are things that have been long hypothesized, but people really haven't been able to find this by directly looking at the specimens we do have. These are things which are much more supported by other sorts of things. So these are some of the things you can do, and the key is that if you want to fit really robust models in the sciences and tackle interesting hypotheses, you really need large amounts of data. And so this is something which is not feasible with really traditional methods, or at least without spending the money that is impossible to have. On the other hand, it's possible using techniques like computer vision because you can dramatically accelerate how quickly you can acquire data. So moving forward, of course, what we want to do is we have, now I'm going to do things in logplot. Now we want to have more and more and more. We want to have like millions and millions and millions of specimens that we scan. And some of the stuff that we're doing is we're constructing, for example, new devices that capture things in 3D. So this is constructible with like $15,000 of parts, and it takes about 2 minutes to scan. And then here are some results that we're able to reconstruct. So this is from the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. And this is not quite the quality of a CT scan, but it's more than enough to power new and interesting studies. All right, so in conclusions, one of the things that I've discovered in trying to use computer vision for scientific problems is it's really all about the data. And so managing the data, understanding your data, this is the thing that drives most of the progress forward. And so in some sense, often the techniques we use are relatively simple, but it's well established and effective techniques paired with really high quality data that we've spent a lot of time working with. The current technology can also have a large impact. And so this is, I think, exciting. So it's an exciting time to be doing computer vision. And then again, it's all about the data. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions about any of these projects, but I also want to acknowledge the students who are involved in this, as well as my alumni who are out there in the world doing lots of good things.